In the 1950s, a man named Marion King Hubbert was working as a geologist for Shell when he came to a relatively obvious conclusion about oil. One day, it would run out. But Hubbert, being the industrious academic that he was, went as far as to predict when that year would be in the United States. He used the information available to him about the rate of discovery of new oil and gas reserves, as well as data for oil consumption in the US, and put together a model. That model not only made a prediction for when the US would run out of crude oil, but also for when the country's crude oil production would peak. This point is known as peak oil. In a paper he wrote in 1956, Hubbert's model predicted that peak oil for the United States would happen sometime between 1965 and 1970. And as it turned out, he was correct. In 1970, American oil production peaked and slowly began to decline. Demand for oil in the country continued to rise, but domestic production was slowing down. There just wasn't enough crude oil left in the ground. The story was nearly the exact same in Canada. Conventional oil sources in Alberta were being developed and depleted faster than they could be replaced with newly discovered reserves. Combined with other factors like higher taxes in the US on Canadian imports under Nixon, the conventional Canadian oil market started experiencing a contraction that it would never recover from. As fate would have it, the peak of conventional Canadian oil production would occur in 1973, the same year as the first modern oil crisis. Even today in 2024, more than 50 years later, 1973 remains the year that Alberta and Canada produced the most conventional oil in a single year. Hubbert's model for American oil production was stunningly accurate. For the remainder of the 20th century, that model predicted the continued decline of domestic American oil production. But early in the 21st century, something started to change. Domestic American oil production drastically shot up. So much so that for years now, we've been sitting well above Hubbert's peak oil level of 1970. There was a new factor at play that Hubbert had not taken into account in his model. That new variable was the rise of synthetic oils. Bitumen, like that from the oil sands, is one of two common types of synthetic oils in North America. The other is shale oil. Shale oil and oil sands bitumen are kind of like polar opposites on the spectrum of geological time. Right smack in the middle of that spectrum sits conventional oil. Conventional crude oil is formed over millions of years under the ideal environmental conditions. Think of it kind of like a medium rare steak. It's the best way to eat red meat, and if you disagree, sorry, but you're wrong. The oil sands sit on one extreme end of the spectrum. They're like an extremely well done steak caked in dirt. What once existed as conventional oil eventually had all of its lighter hydrocarbons eaten away by bacteria and has soaked into a sandy layer of the Earth's crust. Shale, on the other hand, is like an extremely rare steak, or even practically uncooked. The organic matter in the sedimentary layers of shale haven't yet experienced the pressures and temperatures to be able to turn into conventional oil. If you left your shale on the grill for however many million more years, the chances are good that it would eventually turn into conventional oil. But if you weren't feeling that patient and your country's domestic conventional oil supplies were low, you could develop technologies and processes to extract oil from that shale. The development of shale reserves in the US essentially revived the American oil industry in the 21st century. But where the United States had shale oil within their borders, Canada had the oil sands. And if synthetic oils were the future, then Canada was ready to turn the oil sands into the largest energy project the world had ever seen, no matter the cost. At the end of the 1970s, the oil sands mining industry was barreling full steam ahead. Great Canadian, Syncrude, and the soon-to-be Al Sands had ushered in the era of the mega project, and while their costs were high, so too were their production forecasts. No company wanted to get left behind when it came to capitalizing on the next frontier of oil in Alberta. Several companies who were already heavily invested in the sands were willing to double down on the opportunity. In 1981, another proposal came together from 6 of the 8 Syncrude partners. This group, consisting of the other 6 lease operators at Syncrude, became known as the Oslo Project. A 77,000 barrel per day facility using the same plant design and technologies from Crude would have represented a big step forward in bringing down the costs of these kinds of megaprojects. But that step turned into a stumble when the Al Sands Consortium collapsed in the early 80s, when construction costs and interest rates went soaring and oil prices went tumbling. With oil prices holding low throughout the 1980s and Prime Minister Brian Mulroney pushing for less government involvement and more privatization of the oil industry, Oslo had nowhere to turn to for support and died in 1992. With the deaths of Al Sands and Oslo, it seemed like the ability for mining megaprojects to get off the ground and running had been more of a fluke with Great Canadian and Syncrude than an emerging trend in the industry. Part of the problem was that for the oil sands to succeed, 3 things needed to happen that just weren't there in the 1980s. New technologies were needed to make it cheaper to produce oil from the sands, that oil was going to have to be selling for a higher price than it was in the 80s, and the policy framework from the provincial and federal governments would have to support rather than inhibit new developments in the sands. When it came to new technologies, a new trend was drilling its way through in Alberta, literally. It was long known that only about 20% of the total oil sands volume could be extracted from surface mining. The other 80% were buried too far below the earth and couldn't be pumped to the surface in their natural state. Natlin's plan to nuke the oil sands in the 50s never came to fruition, but it also wasn't the last time that people tried to develop an in-situ process to access that deeply buried bitumen. Imperial Oil had a couple of ideas cooking in that department. Inspired by techniques used to extract heavy oil in California, Imperial began testing cyclic steam stimulation, or CSS, in the 1960s near Cold Lake. Nicknamed the steam soak, or the huff and puff, the basic idea is that hot water gets injected into a deep oil sand deposit, which heats up the oil and lowers its viscosity. Eventually, the oil would flow enough to be pumped out like normal. Problem was, you'd have to wait potentially weeks after injection for the steam to soak through before you could start pumping. But Roger Butler suspected there had to be a better way. As a chemist working for Imperial, Butler patented an idea he had for an improved in-situ method. He didn't know it at the time, but this would be the biggest technological leap in the oil sands since the hot water separation process was discovered more than 50 years prior, and it changed everything. The new process was called Steam-Assisted Gravity Drainage, or SAGD. The idea was similar to CSS. Steam would be pumped into the ground to heat up the deep bitumen deposits. But the difference relied on not just one well, but 2 parallel wells, placed closely together and dug horizontally through a deposit. The upper line would inject steam into the bitumen deposit, which would heat up and begin to drip down to the lower line with the help of gravity, at which point it could be pumped to the surface. From a technical perspective, not only was it difficult to drill one horizontal well, but guiding 2 tightly spaced parallel wells was next to impossible with the technologies available in the 60s. But by the 80s and 90s, computer-assisted well drilling made it possible to position parallel horizontal wells with extreme accuracy. The breakthrough of SAGD had a dramatic effect on the barrier to entry for oil sand operations. The relatively inexpensive SAGD process allowed smaller oil companies to get their foot in the door without having to front the enormous startup costs like Great Canadian or Syncrude did for their mining projects in the 60s and 70s. But these technological advancements would still need to be accompanied by policies that made investing in Alberta's oil sands appealing. And as it turned out, a new political age was dawning on Alberta that would bring with it a completely different financial landscape for the oil sands. With the National Energy Program in the rearview but not forgotten, by the 1990s, the federal and provincial governments had learned to play nice when it came to the oil industry, for the most part. In 1993, Mulroney was out and the Liberals were back in Parliament with Jean Chrétien as Prime Minister. It may surprise many Albertans how much of an ally Chrétien's Liberals were when it came to the oil sands. As president of the Treasury Board under Pierre Trudeau, Chrétien helped to prevent the Syncrude Consortium from collapsing in 1975 when Atlantic Richfield dropped out. As Prime Minister, Chrétien was not shy about boasting how when it came to the oil sands, growth in Alberta's tax base would benefit the entire country.
Alors, et par contre, on a aidé aussi à la province de l'Alberta en les aidant à développer leur sable bitumineux parce que nous savons que dans l'intérêt de tous les Canadiens, il est très important de développer les technologies et le potentiel de ces réserves pour être utilisées plus tard. C'est ça qu'est le Canada. c'est d'être capable de trouver dans chaque secteur du pays ce qui fonctionne, qui peut aller bien, et tout le monde en profite. Parce que si les pétroliers font de l'argent en Alberta, ils paient des taxes au gouvernement central qui les redistribue à travers toutes les provinces du Canada.
Under Chrétien, Ottawa had eased up on heavy taxes for the oil industry and was even contributing subsidies to spur the growing sector. But it was Alberta's new provincial government that really turned the province into corporate Cloud 9. At the end of 1992, Alberta's newly elected premier, Ralph Klein, took office. Yes, the same Ralph Klein who, as mayor of Calgary, had wanted Alberta to let the Eastern Bastards freeze in the dark during the oil shocks was who Albertans had chosen to run their province. Klein's solution to the majority of problems facing Alberta in the 1990s was massive cuts to the provincial government's budget and to taxes. This included cutting 9 of the province's 26 ministries as well as $700 million of spending. Consequently, it was a terrible time to be working in or reliant on public services. A lot of these spending cuts hit the environmental, education, and health departments. Under Klein, as a cost-saving measure, Calgary General Hospital, where Klein himself was born, was demolished. Which just seeps with symbolism. While the public sector was taking a beating, it was a great time to be around if you were an investor or a corporation. Klein's government reduced taxes across the board on personal and corporate income tax. No changes to the provincial sales tax were required because Alberta was already the only province in the country without one. To protect that status, Klein's government introduced the Alberta Taxpayer Protection Act, which made it so that any proposal for a sales tax in Alberta would have to get approval through a referendum. The taxman had eased up in Alberta, and with it, Klein had ushered in the era of the Alberta Advantage. Unlike some others, my government will not try to buy prosperity through higher taxes. Instead, it will build on Alberta's existing advantage of low taxes and its free enterprise spirit to develop the most competitive economy in North America. The government will strengthen the Alberta advantage and sell it aggressively around the globe. As far as politicians go, with Ralph Klein, what you saw was what you got. He was predictable, and that was something that appealed to investors. They knew that projects in oil and gas under Klein would not be taking any sharp turns as a result of changes to provincial policy. In fact, one of the big early policy changes under Klein's government was a complete overhaul of the royalty system for the oil sands, which significantly benefited the companies working the sands. During the years of Peter Lougheed and Pierre Trudeau, royalties and taxes from the provincial and federal governments had grown across all aspects of the oil industry, which delayed companies from achieving profitability and ultimately killed a lot of future investment. Klein's approach was to change the tax rules such that only after a company had proven profitable would they start paying royalties. Klein's updated policy demanded only a 1% production royalty from a project until all the development costs were recovered. The trade-off was that once the company was profitable, the province's cut from net revenue would jump to 25%. This was exactly the kind of royalty system the industry had been lobbying the province for years. The cherry on top was that the province also now allowed capital expenses for oil sand projects, including R&D and operating costs, to be 100% tax deductible. The final piece of the puzzle to success in the sands was oil prices. At the start of the 2000s, oil prices would begin an ascent that would continue almost unrelentingly throughout the decade. With these sky-high prices, the oil sands were more than just profitable. They were a no-brainer. The market conditions, federal and provincial policy environment, and technological maturity had all coalesced, and there had never been a better time for developing the oil sands. And so, the industry churned and churned and churned. While previously maybe only 1 or 2 oil sands projects would start per decade, the 10-year span starting in 1999 saw more than a dozen projects hit the ground running, in situ and mining alike, and a dozen more the following decade. With these projects came a steady boom of growth in the province's output from oil sands production. Early in the 2000s, the oil sands hit 2 astounding milestones. In 2002, output from the oil sands surpassed production from conventional sources in Alberta. And just 2 years after that, more than 1 million barrels of oil from the sands were being produced every single day. The turn of the millennium was the start of a boom for Alberta, and it helped to keep Ralph Klein massively popular in the province, even earning himself the nickname of King Ralph. He won his third consecutive majority government in 2001, with 74 of the available 83 seats in the provincial legislature. To open his victory speech that night, he started with a greeting.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Ralph's world.
For many, it was a good time to be an Albertan, and the province was raking in royalties galore. At the Calgary Stampede in 2004, Ralph Klein arrived with a sign hoisted above his head that came with an announcement to the province. Alberta's debts had been paid in full. The province had managed to bring in enough cash over the past few years, and had cut enough services, to balance the budget and fully repay their debt, which was sitting at about $23 billion when Klein first took office in 1993. In 2005, Klein's government was running a massive spending surplus on the back of low taxes and high oil prices. They had so much money, they didn't know what to do with it. Klein ended up issuing a one-time tax-free dividend to each Albertan of $400, which became known as the Ralph Bucks payment. If you ignore the decline in social services and infrastructure investments at the time, Alberta was getting richer under the benevolent King Ralph. Since then, industrialization of the oil sands has only continued. Northern Alberta now sits at a total of 11 large-scale mining projects and expansions, including the original Suncor and Syncrude projects, as well as more than 25 in-situ facilities. In 2021, the combined output from all oil sand operations was a monumental 3.1 million barrels of bitumen per day. The oil sands now make up 85% of Alberta's oil production. It's estimated that as of 2024, more oil has now been produced from the oil sands than all conventional sources in Alberta since the Leduc discovery in 1947. We are now living in the glory days for the oil sands. Or at least, we would be, if it weren't for some serious unintended consequences that have come from developing the sands. So far, we've talked about the history, the science, the engineering, the politics, and the economics of the oil sands. But in order to give a comprehensive view of the impact the oil sands have had on Alberta, it's time to address the elephant in the room. The fundamental issue with the oil sands, which is their cost to the environment. Cue the booze. As you might imagine, when the oil industry started up in the late 19th century, environmentalism was barely a thought in the collective conscience. And for the longest time, output from the oil sands was so insignificant there wouldn't have been much to complain about there in the first place. But the exponential growth of the industry over the past few decades has also brought to light a plethora of environmental problems created by oil sand developments, and has made it clear that collectively, we do not have a handle on the harmful side effects of this industry. Because the sands are so big and so profitable, almost every environmental issue associated with them is downplayed, greenwashed, or ignored. But these are not problems to be taken lightly. I'm not here to preach to you that using fossil fuels is immoral, or to tell you that the oil sands should be abandoned and left undeveloped. But I'm also not here to tell you that the way the sands are currently being developed is totally fine. If left unchecked, the oil sands have the potential to bring massive problems to Alberta's doorstep. Now, I don't want to spend too much time on carbon emissions because there's a lot of other interesting angles to environmental issues around the oil sands, so let's get right at it. Every time a fossil fuel like oil gets burned, carbon gases like CO2 are emitted into the atmosphere. Carbon emissions are arguably the most commonly discussed issue associated with the oil sands, due to the impact carbon emissions have on climate change, which affects not only Canadians, but everyone in the world. Canada only accounts for about 2% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions, but today production from the oil sands makes up about 11% of that. There's a couple main ways to reduce carbon emissions. One is to just stop burning as much fossil fuel. Reducing dependence on fossil fuels in Alberta is an incredibly challenging problem from a technical perspective, but politically, it's next to impossible. Economically, Alberta cannot accept the idea that the world wants to move away from oil and gas. This is not a conservative Albertan policy. This is the same perspective the provincial NDP has as well. The foundation of their modern economy and prosperity relies on it, and any political party in Alberta who were to campaign on completely moving away from oil and gas would be guaranteed to fail. What Alberta has convinced themselves they can accept is to move away from carbon emissions while continuing to produce and use fossil fuels. This means achieving carbon neutrality. Carbon neutrality, or net zero, is when the amount of carbon emitted in a year is equal to the amount extracted from the atmosphere. Carbon is naturally removed from the atmosphere via photosynthesis in trees and plants, but nowhere near the levels we currently emit. Which is why carbon capture research has exploded in recent decades, and Alberta is betting big that carbon capture will pave the way for Alberta's oil industry to continue to prosper for the rest of the century at least. The problem is, carbon capture is being treated like a silver bullet by the oil industry, which with the current state of these technologies, it is very much not. Thankfully, Canada doesn't need to rely solely on carbon capture technologies, because the country is full of natural carbon capture sources as well: trees. But problematically, recent summers have been host to some of the worst fire seasons in history, and Alberta's oil sands industry is directly feeling the heat. In 2016, a forest fire near Fort McMurray grew and eventually engulfed a huge portion of the city. Fort McMurray was evacuated, and although several provincial, federal, and military organizations were called in to help fight the fire, more than 2,400 buildings burned to the ground, and 1.5 million acres of land were impacted. This fire claimed the title for the most expensive natural disaster in Canadian history by a long shot. As forest fire seasons last longer and contain larger fires, which in Canada are currently trending that way, then carbon emissions will rise, making the goal of carbon neutrality that much harder to reach. Another part of the problem is that in order to truly track the path to carbon neutrality, there needs to be consistently accurate measurement and reporting of emission quantities. It's pretty straightforward. You need to know how much carbon you're emitting so you can make sure you have the capacity to recapture the same amount. Unfortunately, there isn't a good consensus on how much greenhouse gases the oil sands industry is emitting. Oil sands companies self-report their emissions for regulatory purposes using what's known as a bottom-up methodology, where emissions are derived using known quantities like the volume of inputs processed and emissions per unit of input for a given processing technology. The alternative to bottom-up is the top-down method, which instead uses measurements from overhead flights and satellite images to calculate total emissions from the entire geographical area. Bottom-up is generally considered to be the more reliable approach, but you'd expect to land in roughly the same ballpark with both ways of measuring emissions. The problem is, recent results from top-down estimates paint a much worse picture for the oil sands. Several recent academic studies using the top-down method estimate that carbon emissions could be anywhere from 65 to more than 6,000% higher than self-reported bottom-up estimates from the oil sands. That would mean that emissions from the oil sands could be larger than the rest of the Canadian economy combined, and that Canada would be punching well above the often quoted 2% of global emissions. That is not a small difference. If carbon capture is meant to balance out emissions from the oil sands going forward, policymakers will have a hard time deciding what data to rely on: the cataclysmic results from academia or the hunky-dory results from the industry. Because carbon emissions are a global issue, they're what tends to get talked about the most when it comes to environmental concerns about the oil sands. But local damage around the sands themselves is also a big problem, especially when it comes to water. The hot water separation process that Karl, Clark, and Sidney Els pioneered more than a century ago built the foundation for the modern oil sands industry. But with exponential increases in oil production came exponential needs for water. To produce a single barrel of bitumen, about half a barrel of fresh water is needed for SAGD in situ extraction, while about 3 barrels are needed for surface mining extraction. The vast majority of water for mining operations is taken from the Athabasca River that passes through Fort McMurray. The provincial government of Alberta sets a limit on consumptive use for each river basin in the province, which is the water that gets used but not returned. Oil operators have been awarded a whopping 92% allocation for consumptive use of water from the Athabasca River basin. On its own, this isn't a problem. The problem lies in the difficulty of reusing and recycling this water. The hot water separation process extracts bitumen from the sand, but left over from this process is a slurry of water and contaminants like clay, heavy metals, and hydrocarbons. Improvements to the process have made it so that some of this water can be filtered out, but the rest is considered unrecoverable. This mix that's left over are known as tailings. Since tailings contain toxic and cancer-causing chemicals, you can't just dump them back into the Athabasca River. So, When Great Canadian first opened up in 1967, they started storing their tailings in what they called tailing ponds. Maybe a pond was a fair descriptor of what they once were, but today, that name is nowhere near accurate. Today, they look a lot more like giant lakes and are so big that they can be seen from space. Just since 2005, oil sand tailing ponds have more than tripled in size. Combined, these ponds now cover more than 200 square kilometers, or about a quarter of the area of Calgary. A single one of Syncrude's tailing ponds surpassed the Hoover Dam in the US as the largest dam in the world by volume of construction materials, by about a factor of 3. Tailing ponds in northern Alberta are now home to trillions of liters of highly contaminated toxic water. Ever since these ponds started up, it's been a problem in the making for the province because of how toxic the water is. In some cases, even just coming into contact with a pond is enough to cause death for wildlife. The companies operating the sands have had to install deterrents like scarecrows and noise cannons to stop wildlife from landing on them. But even then, it's estimated that thousands of birds die every year just from landing on the surfaces of tailing ponds. Fish cannot survive in their waters. They're devoid of life and dangerous to everything around them. As far back as the 1970s, the government of Alberta acknowledged the environmental risks that tailing ponds pose to the surrounding environment, particularly to local watersheds. But at the time, the oil sand companies simply did not possess the technology to be able to make this water clean again. It also didn't help that they were so focused on making the oil sands profitable that they were completely unconcerned with cleaning up the mess they were making if it meant having to spend money on it. Instead, their solution was to just wait. The tailings weren't going anywhere, and chances were that sometime down the line, someone would figure out a solution for how to filter the water in the tailing ponds and safely dispose of the toxic components. But 50 years later, just like flying cars and hoverboards, that technology just doesn't exist. In part because over those past 50 years, oil sand companies haven't really had an incentive to do anything about it. But tailing ponds are toxic time bombs waiting to wreak havoc. Some of these ponds sit just hundreds of meters from the Athabasca River. If one of the dikes on a tailing pond fails, or leaks, or even if it just rains too much, all of a sudden, all of those forever chemicals are sent straight into the Athabasca River. The Athabasca starts all the way up in Alberta's Rocky Mountains and snakes its way northeast through the province. After passing through Fort McMurray, it continues to flow north almost all the way up to the Territories before emptying on the southwestern edge of Lake Athabasca. On that southwestern shore is the small settlement of Fort Chipewyan, also known as Fort Chip, and is mostly inhabited by indigenous Cree, Dene, and Métis people. Fort Chip and most of northern Alberta overlaps with the Treaty 8 region. When colonial settlers began moving into central and western Canada, a series of treaties covering massive portions of the country were agreed upon between the Canadian government and the many First Nations within the treaty areas. Treaty 8, like most of the other numbered treaties, allowed for colonial settlement within certain areas of the treaty boundaries, as well as resource extraction rights for things like lumber and minerals. In return, First Nations would be entitled to certain types of material and financial compensation, as well as the perpetual right to hunt, trap, and fish from their lands. Under the treaties, Canada would be allowed to expand west into First Nation territories, and in return, those First Nations would be entitled to maintain the way of life they had been for generations. Or at least, that was what was supposed to happen. Hunting and fishing grew to become the biggest industries around Fort Chip, and that was the way it was for a long time. But in 1982, the same year the Constitution Act affirmed those hunting, trapping, and fishing rights for First Nations in Canada, things started to change around Fort Chip. Specifically, the fish. All of a sudden, fish from the lake and the river started tasting like gasoline. When cooked, these fish would drip black fat and smelled like burning rubber. The same thing was happening to the fish at Fort McKay, another mostly indigenous settlement north of Fort McMurray. As it turned out, Suncor had accidentally spilled large amounts of oil sand byproducts into the Athabasca River after a series of fires and accidents at the plant. They knew this was a big problem, and they called ahead to the communities downstream from the plant to let them know not to drink the water. Did you buy that? No? Well, in fact, Suncor did know this would be a problem, but decided not to tell anyone living downstream about the spill. Unsurprisingly, residents at Fort Chip started getting sick, and the issues with the fish started getting noticed. Suncor was eventually charged by the province with more than a dozen offenses under the Fishery Act for polluting the Athabasca River and was staring down a maximum possible fine of about $1.4 million. Suncor argued that because the company was struggling to turn a profit, they didn't have the capital to allocate to spill prevention measures that would have stopped the incident from happening. After the province concluded its investigation, from that upper possible limit of $1.4 million, Suncor was fined a whopping $38,000 for their mess. The provincial government awarded Fort Chip a measly $45,000 as compensation, to be split between the 20 fishermen who were impacted by the spill. To boot, the commercial fishery in Lake Athabasca was closed by the province for 2 years due to the contamination from Suncor's spill. Now out of work for 2 years and with an undrinkable, toxic watershed, it was becoming clear in Fort Chip that the Crown was not concerned about upholding the Treaty 8 right to preserve the Indigenous way of life in northern Alberta that had been agreed to when the treaty was signed. Something else has also started changing the way of life in Fort Chip recently. This time, it wasn't about the fish or the water, but the people. The small town has an abnormally high rate of cholangiocarcinoma, otherwise known as bile duct cancer. Cancers like this can be caused from a number of different things. One possible way is exposure to arsenic, benzene, and other hydrocarbons, which are all byproducts of bitumen separation done in oil sands mining operations. The same compounds that would have been present in that spill in 1982, or any of the many other spills since then. Once these chemicals get into the river, it's not just the drinking water in the upstream settlements that gets contaminated. Plants and animals absorb these substances too, making it impossible to live off the land without constantly exposing yourself to these carcinogens. In 2006, Dr. John O'Connor started raising concerns about the higher than normal cancer rates in Fort Chip to provincial and federal health authorities. O'Connor worked as a physician in Fort McMurray, but traveled north a couple days a week to see patients in Fort Chip. He believed the rise in cancer rates in Fort Chip could have been caused by tailings from the oil sands that had made their way north through the Athabasca River. Dr. O'Connor brought his concerns forward to Health Canada about what he had found and was ignored. He managed to grab their attention when he started talking to the media about the high rates of diseases in Fort Chip. When Health Canada finally sent a team of physicians to Fort Chip, it was clear that they had already made up their minds about the water quality. One of the first things one of the physicians did upon arriving there was to grab a cup of tap water, drink it down in front of a reporter, and basically say, "See, there's nothing wrong with it." As thanks for bringing the issue into the public spotlight, several physicians from Health Canada filed complaints against Dr. O'Connor with the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Alberta, the regulatory body for doctors in the province. They claimed he had caused undue alarm with his statements about Fort Chip. During the following 2-year trial, his name was dragged through the mud, his credibility questioned, and he ended up moving out of the province. He was eventually cleared of any wrongdoing, but it goes to show that even questioning the impacts the oil sands are having on human life along the Athabasca can paint a serious target on your back. Unfortunately, it's incredibly difficult to accumulate the kind of evidence needed to specifically say that cancer rates in Fort Chip are a result of oil sands tailings, let alone to lay that blame with any one company. The kinds of comprehensive, independent health studies needed in northern Alberta to draw those kinds of conclusions just never seem to happen, regardless of how many doctors like John O'Connor keep asking for them. It might be understandable if these kinds of tailing spills only occurred as rare, one-of-a-kind events, but there are countless examples of spills and leaks from oil sands projects. Just last year, in February 2023, 5.3 million liters of tailings spilled from a pond at Imperial's Curl mine into the surrounding environment. This came after another spill from the same mine 9 months earlier. Frustratingly, and perhaps unsurprisingly, Imperial Oil failed to warn Fort Chip or any other First Nations community downstream about these spills. These stories about Fort Chip are a microcosm for the environmental issues of the oil sands. I've only picked a few examples of spills to highlight, but these are by no means the only occurrences of these kinds of events. There are so many instances of spills from tailing ponds that clearly the oil sands industry does not have a grip on how to contain their tailings and prevent northern Alberta from becoming a toxic dumping ground. Now, I'd like to go on a bit of a tangent about a boy named Steve from Toronto. Steve never really saw himself getting into a career in politics, but was interested in it enough to join up with his high school's Young Liberals Club. Steve admired Pierre Trudeau when it came to his stance on issues like opposition to Quebec separatism. But as a young man after high school, Steve moved from Toronto to Calgary to work in the mailroom at Imperial Oil. By the time the 80s rolled around, Steve's view on Trudeau and the Liberals took a nosedive thanks to the National Energy Program. Not only did the NEP negatively impact his employer Imperial, who were majority foreign-owned, but he was personally witnessing the economic impacts the NEP was having across Alberta. It was this experience of living through the NEP in Calgary that drove Stephen Harper into politics. Harper began his political ascent with the Reform Party as its chief policy officer in 1987 and was elected to the House of Commons in 1993. A decade later, Harper was leading a unified Conservative Party, after merging the Reform Party, by then renamed the Canadian Alliance, with what was left of the Progressive Conservative Party. After Pierre Trudeau's death in 2000, Harper wrote an op-ed verbally eviscerating the late Prime Minister. The fact that Trudeau had died just a week prior did nothing to hold back Harper's scathing contempt of the man. In 1977, economics and finance didn't much matter to me. Beginning with the NEP, Mr. Trudeau would show me that they did matter, a lesson he never bothered to master himself. And in 2006, Stephen Harper found himself in the proverbial penthouse when he became Prime Minister of Canada. Harper's track record when it came to oil and gas was not the best. Not because he wasn't an advocate for the industry, but basically the opposite. During their tenure, Harper's government consistently and repetitively touted Canada as an energy superpower while ignoring and/or mocking the environmentalism movement growing underfoot within Canada. Upon election, thousands of federal environmental reviews for industrial projects were cancelled by his government, including for oil, gas, and pipeline developments. And by 2011, Canada announced that they were pulling out of the Kyoto Protocol on climate change, an international agreement under which Canada had previously agreed to decrease their greenhouse gas emissions. Under Harper, environmental policies were never a serious consideration if it meant they were going to cost the country a penny.
Frankly, Mr. Speaker, under the current circumstances of the oil and gas sector, it would be crazy economic policy to do unilateral penalties on that sector. We're clearly not going to do it.
Every time Harper dug in against environmental policies, it brought more and more of a spotlight on Canada as a villain in the fight against climate change, and it would come back to bite not only Harper, but the country. The stronger that spotlight got, the more people started paying attention to the two biggest targets in Canada's petroleum industry, the oil sands and the pipelines that connected to them. As output from the oil sands grew into the 21st century, so did the need for increased pipeline capacity in Alberta. The Enbridge mainline from Alberta to Montreal has been upgraded several times since its initial construction, and remains the highest throughput and most critical oil pipeline for supplying Canadian energy within the country. But by the mid-2010s, 4 significant new projects were either underway or were in the planning and approval stage to get even more oil moving from Alberta. The first was an expansion to the recently completed Keystone Pipeline connecting Alberta to the American Midwest. The first phase of the project was completed by TransCanada Pipelines, now known as TC Energy, in 2010. The proposed extension along a more direct route was referred to as Keystone XL, and would nearly double the throughput of the Keystone pipeline system. Secondly, TC Energy had also proposed the Energy East project to convert their old natural gas pipeline to Montreal into an oil pipeline. Not only that, but the proposal included the construction of a nearly 1,600-kilometer extension of the line from Montreal all the way to New Brunswick to bring oil all the way from Alberta to the Atlantic Ocean entirely on Canadian soil. Thirdly, Enbridge's Northern Gateway project was a proposal to build a twin line between the coast of central BC and Alberta. One line would bring Alberta crude from the oil sands to BC's coast, while the other line would bring imported oil-thinning condensates from BC to Alberta. And lastly, Kinder Morgan, who had acquired the Trans Mountain Pipeline in 2005, were proposing an upgrade to the line by building a second, wider pipe along the existing pathway that would nearly triple the line's capacity. If you read the business section in any Canadian newspaper in 2014, you'd think all of these new pipeline projects meant Alberta oil would be powering nearly the entire world in 10 years' time. But building pipelines in the 21st century has come with some serious baggage. When the Enbridge and Trans Mountain pipelines were built in the 1950s, there were no such thing as environmental regulations, environmental assessments, or land consultations. The approval process is so much more involved now, and the public is also more aware of the issues pipelines can create for their communities. As a result, pipelines have become a lightning rod for the environmental damage that comes with the oil industry, and are an obvious target for environmental protests. In the mid-2010s, these kinds of protests presented a threat to getting pipeline projects off the ground, or at least, that's what oil and pipeline companies were telling people. At the same time though, a drop in oil prices in 2014 due to global oversupply put an end to more than a decade of the growing price of oil, which really put a dent in the financial viability of a lot of these proposals. Oil sands bitumen is some of the most expensive in the world to produce, and if producers couldn't guarantee a solid margin on sale prices, these high-cost, long-term pipeline projects didn't look so appealing anymore. And so, for a mix of reasons, one by one, these new pipeline projects started to fall apart. Environmental concerns about Keystone XL's route through sensitive ecosystems and native land drove several high-profile protests around the pipeline, including blockades along the proposed pipeline's path. Significant political pressure led President Obama to delay the Keystone XL expansion, and the project's permit was ultimately revoked by President Biden on his first day in office in 2021. The Energy East pipeline proposal in its essence was a response to the impending collapse of the Keystone XL project. Energy East's proposal came in 2014 at the end of the Harper era and was eventually cancelled in 2017. TC Energy cited new environmental regulations as the main reason for the project's cancellation, but signs indicate that the decision had more to do with market conditions than anything else. It also didn't help that there were still several expensive technical questions left unanswered about the project by the time it was cancelled, like how the pipeline would be routed underneath the St. Lawrence River. The Northern Gateway project faced significant pushback from local and Indigenous communities in BC, largely because of the risk of oil spills polluting the Fraser River. In 2015, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau banned oil tanker traffic on BC's north coast. With no way for oil piped to the coast to go anywhere by boat, the project was as good as dead. In theory, the Trans Mountain expansion should have been an easier sell since the entire path of the pipeline had been carrying oil for decades already. But environmental opposition to this project was enormous as well. Adding to that was the fact that when BC's new provincial NDP government was elected in 2017, they announced they were also opposed to the project's development and threatened to restrict oil shipments through their province. These challenges led Kinder Morgan to nearly cancel the project in 2018. At the last minute, the Canadian government stepped in and purchased the entire project from Kinder Morgan for $4.5 billion to prevent it from collapsing. The project was recently completed this year in 2024, more than a decade after its proposal, and with a final price tag of $34 billion, significantly higher than the initial expectations of less than $10 billion when the project was sold to the federal government. The ordeal of the Trans Mountain expansion, which is a pipeline upgrade along an existing oil pipeline route, shows just how expensive it is and how much public resistance there is to new oil projects in Canada today. It's difficult to predict what the trajectory of the oil sands looks like for the future. In 2015, a forecast by the Canadian Energy Research Institute projected production from the oil sands could rise as high as 5.5 million barrels per day by 2035. In 2017, the National Energy Board gave the slightly lower estimate for 2035 of 4.4 million barrels per day. These kinds of predictions are hard to get right, since a lot can change over the course of a couple of decades when it comes to market conditions and policy decisions. But one thing is clear. SAGD has been a game changer for the sands. Production from in-situ SAGD projects is forecasted to continue growing thanks to the fact that they're generally less expensive, have a lower environmental impact, and the fact that there's so much more bitumen recoverable with that technology. The fact that they don't require federal approval like mining projects do also doesn't hurt. Mining, on the other hand, is looking like it won't be growing all that much. Several existing mines like Horizon and Mildred Lake North are nearly depleted and will be winding down operations over the next few years. Suncor's Base Mine has about 10 years left in it, and they're holding off applying for their Base Mine extension approval until 2025, which by nothing but pure chance just so happens to coincide with the next scheduled federal election. Getting new mining projects off the ground has also proven challenging as of late. Similar to pipelines in the past decade, oil sands operations have had their fair share of challenges navigating the current industrial climate. The Tech Frontier project was a proposal for a new oil sands mining operation that was recently cancelled by the company who owned it. In their letter abandoning the development, Teck implied that environmental concerns were one of the big hurdles holding back the project. But again, the actual issue appears to be that the financial viability of the project relied on a per-barrel oil price that was about $20 higher than what's predicted to be the case for the coming decade. The cancellation of the Teck Frontier mine bears a striking resemblance to the collapse of Al Sands in the early 80s. With oil prices sitting low and environmental concerns about oil sands projects not going anywhere, it's possible that Teck's step back from the oil sands is a sign of what's to come for Alberta's energy industry for the near future. But if there's one thing that can be said for certain about Canada's energy future, is that it will be electric. With a growing population and a growing momentum to transition towards electric vehicles, the fact of the matter is that Canada's electricity demands are only set to keep growing. Alberta is looking at what their best options are for expanding their electric grid while keeping in mind the need to reduce carbon emissions and develop a carbon-neutral grid. Alberta currently has their sights set on 2050 as the goal for when carbon neutrality can be achieved for the electrical grid in the province. However, for some, this isn't good enough. A big conflict in Alberta's energy future has come yet again with the Trudeau government in Ottawa. Canada's federal government is also making a push to decarbonize Canada's electric grid. A draft federal policy for clean electricity regulations released in 2023 aims to create a net zero emissions grid for all of Canada by 2035, 15 years earlier than Alberta is targeting. Alberta's Premier Danielle Smith thinks that the federal target is unrealistic for her province. To be fair, 2035 is an extremely aggressive target. But that's kind of the point. The longer the country waits to reduce our emissions, the worse our climate-related problems will get. With the feds and the province yet again at odds over energy, there's a perceived overreach of power by the federal government in Alberta. This has led Danielle Smith to invoke Alberta's Sovereignty Act, a provincial act which Premier Smith's government recently wrote and passed to bestow upon themselves some new powers. The Sovereignty Act gives Alberta's legislature the ability to refuse to enforce specific federal laws or policies that violate the jurisdictional rights of Alberta. In this case, the requirement to achieve a net zero grid by 2035, something that Premier Smith's government is worried will compromise the reliability of Alberta's electricity supply, which has already been a problem lately. Some legal experts are skeptical that the Sovereignty Act will hold up in court. The grid may be a matter of provincial jurisdiction, but protection of the environment is recognized as being a shared duty of both the provincial and federal levels of government, which ultimately will require compromise. Either way, this is not the first time Alberta and the federal government have sparred over energy jurisdiction in the province, and it certainly won't be the last. The silver lining here is that this conflict is not because Alberta doesn't want to decarbonize their energy industry, but because they're concerned about when it can realistically be accomplished. I would say it's a bit of a stereotype in Eastern Canada that Albertans are climate change deniers, but in general, that's not really the case today. In fact, even in the past 20 years, things have substantially improved in the messaging from provincial leadership when it comes to the environment. You only need to look back as far as our buddy Ralph to see how far we've come. Before becoming Premier, Ralph Klein was the Provincial Environment Minister, which is hilarious considering that he loathed environmentalism. Ralph Klein was a science skeptic, a proud climate change denier, and all-around pro-industry when it came to anything resembling modern environmental policies. In 1990, Klein's government tried to get the University of Alberta to fire a professor of aquatic ecology. The reason was because that professor was alerting the public to the cancer-causing risks associated with a proposed pulp mill on the Athabasca River, which Klein's government was trying to force through. Klein often bragged about and seemed proud of his limited understanding of science. And all of this skepticism of science and disbelieving of experts was from a premier who himself never finished high school. The attitude from Alberta's premiers on climate change, thankfully, has gotten much more serious since then. While Danielle Smith may not be in agreement with the federal government's aggressive emission targets, her government is putting their money where their mouth is when it comes to investing in reductions to Alberta's carbon emissions. The dominant wedge between Alberta and the federal government on climate change is not whether climate change is a threat, but rather what needs to be done about it and when it needs to be done. Alberta's current provincial government has its sights set on carbon neutrality by 2050, but for the most part, that's an arbitrary placeholder. Many of the kinds of comprehensive studies required to build a plan to get to net zero still need to be done. And from what's been disclosed, the province still seems heavily reliant on carbon capture technologies to make it happen. It's concerning that Alberta's only real plan is for technologies of tomorrow to fix the problems of today. Where have I heard that one before? The oil sands are Alberta's poison chalice. The sands enabled the growth of a powerful 20th century economy and propelled the province and the country to economic prosperity. Quite literally, the oil sands built Alberta as it exists today. But if left unchecked, unbridled growth without sufficient environmental oversight could also destroy it. One thing about the oil sands is for certain: they're not infinite. One day, likely in the distant future, just like conventional oil, production of bitumen from the oil sands will peak at a level never to be reached again. And on that day, we can only hope that we've figured out how to leave northern Alberta better than we found it. On that note, I'll leave you with a quote by Marion King Hubbert on the perils of the pursuit of constant growth. During the last 2 centuries of unbroken industrial growth, we have evolved what amounts to an exponential growth culture. Our institutions, our legal system, our financial system, and our most cherished folkways and beliefs are all based upon the premise of continuing growth. Since physical and biological constraints make it impossible to continue such rates of growth indefinitely, it is inevitable that cultural adjustments must be made. Thanks for watching my series on the Alberta oil sands. If you'd like to help me continue making this type of Canada-focused content, go ahead and check out my Patreon that I just launched. As part of my Patreon, you'll get early access to all video releases, an invitation to my Discord server, access to behind-the-scenes content, and more. Your support would be greatly appreciated, so go ahead and check it out if it sounds like that would interest you. Thanks for watching.